But what we know is that Initiative 71 was much more narrow, and legislation to legalize the recreational use of marijuana by adults requires legislative action, and this bill that we will present to the council will do exactly that.
That was D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser after the passage of the Safe Cannabis Sales Act back in 2019. This was just the first major step in the fight to repeal the many restrictions on the current D.C. cannabis market. Small possessions of marijuana were decriminalized here in D.C. back in 2014, but the abundance of government regulations since then have been major obstacles for many small businesses in this community.
They're not legal. You can't start these businesses legally, just like in Georgia or in Mississippi. You can't start a legal marijuana business because the regulatory frame just isn't there. So right now in DC, if you're an entrepreneur looking to break into the marijuana industry, the legal options for you are limited.
Because DC is not a state, it has some of the most confusing marijuana laws in the entire country. Those who wish to start cannabis businesses here are often confused about what's legal here and what isn't. Unlike states like Colorado and Washington, there are no recreational dispensaries here. While it is legal to possess marijuana here, it is not legal to buy it or sell it in any form. Confusing, right?
So since that ballot measure passed, however, Congress added provisions in the federal budget that would bar the district from using its own taxpayer dollars to regulate drugs, including marijuana. So that means we have a situation in DC where possession of marijuana is legal. You can grow some plants in your home, but you can't go to dispensaries like you can in Colorado, California, Illinois to buy marijuana at shops.
One of the biggest models is a sticker store. You go into this shop and you pay, $50 for a sticker, and they'll just happen to give you some marijuana at the same time.
This all began back in 2014 when the ACLU released their study on the DC Police Department and the massive racial disparity in marijuana law enforcement.
Of course, one of the statistics that we learned from the ACL study is that there is people of color are 3.7 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis, even though no matter what race, we all are, prone to using cannabis as statistically at the same amounts.
This resulted in a large public outcry from the residents, and soon after, DC City Council voted to decriminalize marijuana.
Tonight, we'll be taking a look at the pros and cons of Washington, D.C. decriminalizing marijuana. It is no longer a crime to have up to an ounce of pot in our nation's capital.
However, only a year later, Prop 71, the legislation that would legalize marijuana in the district, passed with overwhelming support. Over 70% of DC residents voted in favor of it. In 2015, this bill was finally put into law, and possessing up to 2 ounces of cannabis, as well as growing a small number of plants in your home, finally became legal. However, this came with almost immediate pushback from Republicans. Right-leaning lawmakers moved quickly to disrupt this legalization process by putting measures in place that made it very difficult to regulate the sale of marijuana in the district. This effort was led by Republican Congressman A.J Harris of Maryland.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, marijuana is neither safe nor legal. Let's get it straight. The Controlled Substance Act makes marijuana in the United States illegal.
He, along with other Republican members of Congress, repeatedly struck down legislation to make it easier to regulate marijuana and made it nearly impossible for a cannabis business to get started here.
Restrictions on marijuana in the district all come back to the congressional writer. So A.J Harris, who's a Republican congressman from Maryland, almost single-handedly led a crusade against marijuana legalization in the District of Columbia. And as part of that, he insisted on adding language to the federal budget that would bar the district from spending money to regulate the sale of marijuana.
In an effort to lift these restrictions, Mayor Bowser introduced the Safe Cannabis Sales Act in 2019 in order to ease the pressure on recreational marijuana. However, this effort hasn't made much progress since then.
But the problem is that right now, DC is not in a position to actually pass and enact this legislation while the congressional rider still exists. So Democrats have unified control of the federal government as of early 2022, but budget negotiations still tend to be more complicated and require some support of Republicans. So often what we see on the federal level is the status quo holds.
So where does the district go from here? It's hard to say exactly.
I mean, the future of marijuana is uncertain in the District of Columbia, but that said, the momentum has been building nationally for the legalization of marijuana sales for recreational purposes. So ultimately, it's a question of when does this congressional prohibition drop?
Mayor Bowser's legislation is certainly a step in the right direction, and since Democrats now control both houses of Congress as well as the appropriations committees, many are optimistic that the rider could be lifted in the near future.